Hello, I'm Joe Tucker, President of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, and welcome to the Rule of Law, the Academy Speaks. This is a continuing discussion I've been having with the two most significant lawyers in the Jeffrey Epstein saga. Today, we're continuing our conversation with my good friend and member of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, Brad Edwards. Brad, thanks for coming back to talk to us again.
Hey, Joe, thanks for having me back.
Yeah. Brad, you wrote a book about Jeffrey Epstein, and it's called Relentless Pursuit: My Fight for the Victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And this traces the whole saga. For those of us who've yet to read your book, because I'm telling you, folks, if you haven't and you want to know what really happened, go out and grab this great book written by Brad and his now wife, Brittany. It is a must read for real facts. So, Brad, take us back to Courtney Wild
Yeah.
in 2008.
Yeah. So I started my career as a prosecutor and was mentored for a long time by my mom's a paralegal. Her boss, Jay Howell. Jay Howell helped to found the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So after leaving the state attorney's office, I told Jay, I want to do the same thing. I only want to represent crime victims in civil cases. And so that's what I was doing. I was pretty fresh. This is 2007. I had been a lawyer for 5 years. And Courtney Wild was somebody
So
who,
you were, I know you weren't, how long had you been practicing? 5 years?
yeah,
And how long had you been practicing civil litigation at that point?
a year. I mean, a very short period of time. So Jay Howell got a call from somebody in the FBI saying that, hey, one of the crime victims needs to talk to you. And Jay called me and said, hey, this is somebody who's cooperating in a federal investigation with Jeffrey Epstein. She's more in your neck of the woods. Will you meet with her? And I said, of course. So Courtney Wild, this is 2008. She's probably 19 years old at the time. And she comes in and tells me this story about how starting at 14 years old, she was sexually abused by this very powerful billionaire in Palm Beach, and that she had been cooperating in a federal investigation for years. And she showed me a letter. And the letter, I remember at the start of it, it says essentially, this is she had received it in January of 2008. And it said, this is a federal investigation. Be patient. It's essentially telling her, don't worry, everything's going fine and don't bother us. But she was having a hard time getting in touch with the government. So she wanted me, as a former prosecutor, to speak with the prosecutors and just make sure everything was on track. And so I started
But
making.
let's back up. Let's
Yeah.
back up. A then 18-year-old comes into your office and says, since age 14, she's been being sexually assaulted by a billionaire.
Yeah. Right.
Does that even sound realistic? Did it sound realistic when she initially came to you?
It did not sound realistic. In fact, I think I left the room and went to my computer and kind of wrote in the guy's name. And I saw a few articles coming up that
Mhm.
talked about underage girls. And I think at the time that Jeffrey Epstein's team had changed the word that was being used to describe them as prostitutes. So it was being underage prostitutes were going to his house. And that was something that Jeffrey Epstein's legal machine on his side did a really good job of instituting that word for these high school kids who were not prostitutes at all. They were just regular high school kids. But there was some description of how one was bringing another friend and they were being paid to give sexual massages. So I went back in the room and talked with Courtney and said, look, I understand that what you're saying is true. And plus, she was handing me a letter from the FBI that told her, you're a victim in a federal case. Ironically, it cited the Crime Victims' Rights Act.
We've heard about that in prior episodes.
Yeah. So at the time, I didn't know much about the Crime Victims' Rights Act because it's this federal statute giving victims rights. So I started contacting the lead prosecutor on the case. It wasn't Alex Acosta, he's at the top, but it was the line prosecutor. And she was unable to give me information and was having what I would describe as very cagey conversations with me, where it was clear her bosses and her boss's boss, up to the top, Alex Acosta, were telling her she basically couldn't tell the victims anything, which I thought, this is a clear violation of something.
Yes.
So I drafted the first, emergency violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, went and filed it in federal court in Palm Beach. It landed in front of Judge Mara, and I got a hearing within 5 days. At that hearing is the first time where I'm telling Judge Mara, I believe that something is happening behind the scenes. I represent now Jane Doe, but she represents all of the Jane Does that are being abused by Jeffrey Epstein, cooperating in this investigation.
So she was sort of the spokes
Yes.
going out.
Yes. Yes. I think that's pretty fair. But the spokes ended up going in all kinds of different directions. But yes. And she was a center person. And the government, so my position was, I believe the government is about to work out a deal with Jeffrey Epstein.
Mm-hmm.
In violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, they're not talking to the victims about it. They're telling the victims, be patient, but I think they're working out a secret deal. And the government stands up and for the first time says, essentially, it's not that we're about to work out a secret deal. We actually already worked out a secret deal back in September of 2007 and gave him federal immunity in Florida under a non-prosecution agreement. Well, even Judge Mara was like, wait, you worked out a secret deal in September of 2007, but you're giving this victim a letter in January of 2008 saying, be patient. All right, there seems to be some merit to what looks like a wacky lawsuit, right?
So the judge was calling bullshit.
Yeah. From the beginning, that gave a lot of credence to what I said. And so our first argument was, well, if there's a non-prosecution agreement, we should get to see it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is the agreement. That is whatever the agreement is that Jeffrey Epstein has with the government that is taking away forever all of the victims' rights. So we should see it. The government
at this point, how many of the victims had you met with?
Three. I met with Courtney. I had met with the young girl who was only 13 at the time who brought Courtney, and I had met with a girl that Courtney had brought. So I had met with three of them, but then I knew that there were at least 100 other victims, and that was just mapping out all of the people that either they had brought or they knew had gone to his house in Palm Beach alone. We didn't yet know that this was happening in New York and New Mexico and other places. This is infancy of our learning curve. But you would think that when we ask a question like, okay, well, we should get to see the non-prosecution agreement, the government would say, here you go. No, they fought us on it. So from the beginning, we were fighting with the government, and we later learned we weren't just fighting with the government. It was the victims against the government in the style, but it was the victims against the government and Epstein who were working together against the victims throughout the case.
Now, why is it, and I know there's no real answer to this question, was the government working with Epstein against the victims?
That's, all I can say is that, we fight as lawyers to make sure that everybody in the eyes of the law is equal. And this was just the first real clear indication that that's not true. That for whatever reason, Jeffrey Epstein was above the law, or at least above the law that anybody else would have to adhere to. He had this team of lawyers Jeffrey Epstein had a philosophy that I learned over time, that it was like, if you know the right person, you can always make something happen that isn't supposed to happen. That was his way of kind of crafting out that he could corrupt the system. So he needed a prosecutor, a former prosecutor that knew people high up in the office. So he hired a former prosecutor that knew somebody. In fact, he hired three of them. I think he hired the former U.S. attorney and several former AUSAs.
Who were probably the bosses of the line prosecutors at some point in time.
Exactly. And with Alex Acosta, he needed somebody who would directly talk to Alex Acosta. Alex Acosta had previously worked at Kirkland Ellis. He got Jay Lefkowitz, who's, by all accounts, one of the premier elite lawyers at the time, and at the top of the pecking order of Kirkland Ellis. And now he has direct line of communication there. And he did that relationship wise when it was time for a discussion to be had, which certain documents ended up revealing between the Southern District of Florida and DOJ.
Mm-hmm.
He hired lawyers who were directly connected to those in the review process at DOJ. So he always had a back channel way of getting to the people that had influence over the situation. In addition to that, he knew politicians, he knew, people in government that could vouch for him. And I would say that's what people were doing. People were vouching for him despite the atrocity that was on paper. I mean, at the time that I'm telling this story right now, this is back in 2008, the government had already uncovered 40 underage girls that they had confirmed he had molested. 40. And they're still hearing, they're still giving an audience to other politically connected people that are vouching for Jeffrey Epstein.
The normal person, 40 confirmed victims. How much time would someone whose name is not Jeffrey Epstein have served in jail for molesting 40 victims?
Yeah, you can't live long enough. I mean, it's multiple life sentences. There's no way with 40 confirmed minors that you get away with anything less than a life sentence.
One of the issues that your book delves into, and I'm literally going to be your book salesman here today, is how Epstein had like this layer of lawyers and law enforcement from the Department of Justice, just this systematic failure or it was rigged in his place. How were you able to penetrate this high rigging of the game?
Yeah, I think that it's a long answer. We had, first of all, Courtney Wild is just a super courageous person, and she was going through a lot of personal problems along the way. But one thing I felt kind of steadied her was this case, and just believing that, she came at it from a different direction, but we were always on the same page. Her position was, had I done this, I'd be in prison forever. Meanwhile, I'm sitting over here with a drug offense and they're putting me in jail for 3 years. Like, this isn't fair. And the unfairness of it means I'll never quit. So I had a client that wanted to see it through to the end. That was one.
Kudos for her.
Yeah. I think the other thing was, like Jack spoke on, Jeffrey Epstein miscalculated, very rarely miscalculated, but miscalculated badly when he sued me. When he filed the lawsuit against me and he became a plaintiff in a lawsuit, recognizing that he couldn't, hide behind the Fifth Amendment on the one hand and then be a plaintiff in a lawsuit on the other, even though he tried with some success. It allowed me to now be a personal party in a lawsuit, and I knew, okay, well, he can't make me go away. So now I can extend this out a very long time. He filed that lawsuit in 2008. I didn't get to the courthouse steps where he wrote out his apology for me, and it was read in open court till 2018. So 9 years of him trying every different way to kind of knock me off. And then the Crime Victims' Rights Act case, nobody could take a shot at us. I mean, it was really Paul Cassell and I who were carried it for the first almost decade.
And that's a name you don't hear often. So let the listeners understand who Paul is.
Yeah, so Paul Cassell is a former Supreme Court clerk. He was a federal judge. He came off the federal bench so that he could teach victims' rights in law school in Utah. And I met Paul kind of by in a funny story. I filed the first pleading in the Crime Victims' Rights Act case and said, I want a hearing. And the clerk said, well, when do you want a hearing? I said, I want it tomorrow. She said, well, it doesn't even say emergency. I said, give it back to me. And I hand wrote emergency on it and handed it back to her. So Paul, when he calls me later that day, he says, hey, did you file a case under the Crime Victims' Rights Act? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I'd like to help you. I said, no, I think I'm fine. He said, well, you did handwrite the first, on the first pleading. And then he tells me his resume, and part of it was helping to draft the Crime Victims' Rights Act, or having some input there.
Mhm.
So I thought, you know what, he's a great mind for knowing how to navigate that case from the victim's point of view in a criminal case. I mean, we're used to representing him in civil cases. So and he's just a brilliant person and a good heart. And he stuck with us all the way through. He was on the team, on the class action team against Deutsche Bank too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tell us about, to the extent you can, tell us about the class action with Deutsche Bank and how that relates to the Epstein cases.
Yeah. So the short version of that is, let's think about how Jeffrey Epstein committed his crimes. There were, at the time, in the early days, we thought Jeffrey Epstein only abused children. It became known to us that that wasn't actually true. He just liked corrupting people, and his preferred age range was 13 to 17, preferred. So with the children, the mantra was, come over to his house, he'll pay you $300 for a massage. Now, once the girl gets to the house, he then pushes his limits, holding the $300 hostage. They realize it's sexual. They're in a room that it's very difficult to get out of. Each of his houses is like a labyrinth, and there's no way out. So they realize they have to do what they have to do wherever he pushes it.
And he lived, and I need you to help people understand where
Yeah.
he lived and how they had to get there as opposed to the community where they lived into, because this is also about income inequality, that all of these victims, these young victims, were poor girls.
Yeah, so these are poor high school kids, mainly on the other side of the tracks, West Palm Beach. A lot of them in the trailer parks, or just lower, even some middle income families, but mostly low income families. They're taking taxi cabs across the bridge to the island, are pretty much around the corner from Mar-a-Lago, actually. And they're coming into this palatial mansion up a essentially secret stairwell that comes off, out of the kitchen, up the stairs, around the corner into this huge bedroom. And then from the bedroom, there's like an annexed massage room. And that's typically where the first encounter would happen. So it's almost impossible for a 14, 15-year-old girl going up there the first time to have any chance of getting out of there. They're really, all of them describe the same fear, and each of them reluctantly has to acquiesce to what's happening in the room in some level of sexual abuse, which Jeffrey Epstein was really good at pushing it as far as he could without having to use physical force, so that he could always have some sort of plausible deniability. It wasn't like he was holding someone down. That was like one of his kind of favorite things. But either way, he would pay $300 cash to the girl that was the brand new victim that he had just abused, and to whatever girl brought that girl. So that's $600. He would do this 3 times a day. So you're talking about $1,800. He's paying about $2,000 a day. Then we learn, he's doing that in New York. Well, that means he has to have access to a lot of cash, which, who has access to that type of cash?
Yes.
So we thought any bank that is banking him has to see this red flags of cash coming out. But I don't think that I hadn't really put my finger on what the case was until the Deutsche Bank consent order came out, and it describes that the attorney for Jeffrey Epstein or the accountant for Jeffrey Epstein were withdrawing like $10,000 of cash a day. And I go, wait, that's a red flag, right?
Yes.
So then when we fast forward to the bank and we realize that there were years where Jeffrey Epstein was withdrawing $1 million of cash a year. Well, maybe in 2002 or 2003, that's still a red flag. Somebody should ask questions. But in 2006, 2005 and 6, when he's arrested and you learn this is primarily, at least with the minors, a cash payment system, not
Yeah.
primarily, only a cash payment system. And he's withdrawing $1 million after he gets out of jail. That means he's still doing it. There's a red flag there. And then now he's a registered sex offender for the bank. The bank now knows he's a registered sex offender. And when he's not withdrawing money, he's wire transferring money to Eastern Europeans. He's wire transferring money to ballet schools, to places where he's now recruiting victims. He's come out of jail, but he's recruiting victims who are 18, 19 years old. And his promises are a little bit different.
Yes.
He senses, okay, this is a girl who's in New York with ambitions, which we teach our kids. That should be a good thing. But he takes it and tries to corrupt them. What they need is a visa to come in the country. She's a new model. I can get you a visa. I can get you a modeling gig. And now I get you in my home, do whatever I want to. I'll hold it over your head. I will pay for your
So
school.
he didn't change who he was. He changed his game a little bit by going offshore with over 18.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But now he's causing them to engage in sex under the pretense that he's helping them in a modeling industry or with a job or getting to school. They come over to his house thinking he's just a nice guy who got a bad rap. They get trapped in his world, and he's either holding their passport over their head, their education, their career, and they then have to keep doing what they're doing, bringing him new victims so that he can do that with them. But the bank is able to see there's money that's going by way of wire transfers to all of these people. There's still cash being withdrawn in exorbitant amounts and wire transfers everywhere. We go, okay, wait. JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan first, then Deutsche Bank, created the financial infrastructure that allowed a sex trafficking operation to continue for decades. And that would be this.
There's a lot of speculation about other people, some very well-known people engaging in sexual activity with some of Jeffrey's victims.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any financial trail that you've been able to see with those individuals, or have you looked into that?
Yeah, so I'll break this into pieces. And I'll say what I can say. With the minors, there are very, very, very few that were engaging in sexual acts with anybody other than Jeffrey Epstein, and at times you've seen in Ghislaine Maxwell's trial as well.
Yes.
The minors were, I don't want to say kept a secret from some of his other friends, but they weren't shared with the other friends. And there's at least one exception to that, maybe two, but very few. With that being said, Jeffrey Epstein was not, like all along, it wasn't only minors. All along, there were 18, 19, 20-year-olds that were being coerced into sexual arrangements that otherwise just wanted a career or wanted a certain education. And there was literally just no way out for them. At times, he would send those women to other friends of his, and he would expect to hear back that they had done what they were supposed to do. And they knew if they didn't, then he could take away from them everything, whether that's their actual job, their education, whatever it was. But that still is a fraction of his victims were sent to a fraction of his friends.
Well, there's this whole mystery about who were his friends.
Yeah.
We both say with a smile.
There's certain things I can tell you and certain things I wish I could tell you, but I can't.
I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. Are there communications between him and his friends about his victims when he was exploiting them?
Not many, but some. I think that some have become at least hinted at publicly related to at least a certain individual that was associated with JP Morgan Bank. And And there are a few that were his friends for long enough that he would brazenly and somewhat openly talk about certain victims and how he could make sure that those meetings took place. But most of them, there's not a paper trail in that way. And he didn't pay, none of his friends paid him directly for any uh, introductions of that kind. I think some of them received it as kind of a fringe benefit to his friendship. If you want to look at it in like the grossest way possible.
Friends with perverted benefits.
Right.
Brad, I want to ask a question that's on a lot of the public's mind, and that's dealing with Jeffrey Epstein's relationship with Donald Trump.
Mhm.
Were you ever able to determine whether or not any of Jeffrey's victims came from Mar-a-Lago or worked at Mar-a-Lago at some point?
Yeah. He at least had, I mean, Virginia Roberts definitely was picked up by Ghislaine Maxwell at Mar-a-Lago. I think President Trump recently said that or acknowledged that. And I think based on what President Trump said, there was more than one person. I think from my recollection, there was at least two, but Virginia's the most well known. So for sure.
Let's talk about, and you pronounce her name Gillian? Gillian
Yeah, Ghislaine.
Ghislaine Maxwell. For those of us who are seeing what's going on now with how she's being treated, tell us about her role in this and how you feel about how she's being treated now by the government.
Um, I don't know about the latter question, like how she's being treated by the government. I understand that she was moved from her facility in Florida over to Texas, and it seems like basically a country club. I don't know the reason for it. What I have been told, and maybe the most plausible explanation that's not that's a decent one, is that because she called the meeting with the Trump organization, and there's this implication that she's kind of ratting someone out, even though if you saw the interview, it doesn't seem like she did that at all. It seems like just a a bunch of self-interested, you know, sound bites that really gave us nothing. But if they moved her because they thought if she was going to be a rat and she was going to then be harmed in jail, I guess that provides them some cover. I can tell you from the victim side, they have thought this is unfair treatment. This is showing again that all people aren't equal under the law. It is rewinding time back to 2008 where Jeffrey Epstein was treated preferentially. And this looks like it's, a sliver of that all over again. And we know, and I don't think that there's any denial of that, this is just a fact, that President Trump and Ghislaine Maxwell were friends. I mean, they were friends back in the 90s. And Jeffrey Epstein and President Trump were friends also in the 90s. So, did one have anything to do with the other? I don't know. But it's in the minds of the victims that it does, and they're very worried that this is leading toward some type of commutation or pardon or some clemency of her sentence.
Brad, what has also been upsetting some of the victims, and I've listened to some of the people who represent the victims, because between yourself, Jack Scarola, and Bob Josephsberg, three members of the Academy, I think you guys represent the lion's share
Yeah.
of the women. But other people who have been, in the airways talking as though they were Brad Edwards, and you're the man on this. It seems as though the victims, I can understand this, are upset that they have been forgotten in this whole thing that's happening right now with the conversations about the release of the files, President Trump, Ghislaine Maxwell. To the extent that you're able to talk about it, how have your client victims been about what's going on now and I'll call it the re-traumatization of what's going on?
Every time there's news, especially when it's conspiratorial or just factually so inaccurate, it affects them, and there are at least 50 that we maintain very close communications with and have received more calls in the last 2 months, probably than the entire time, any one period of time that we've litigated the case since 2008. So we're going on 18 years, right? And I would say that the headlines recently have been harmful to the victims. I think that, not I think, the victim's position before all this started, before all the hoopla recently started, would have been leave well enough alone and let it die off. But when there's a platform of we're going to release all the files that then turns into a about face, we're releasing no files, and then that seems to have promulgated this social media craziness where everybody then creates conspiracy theories on top of one another. There's no way this can possibly end now and the victims can heal and move on unless there's full transparency and the files are released with the redactions of victims' names, as they don't need to be hurt in this process. So that's pretty much what I've been assigned with advocating for on their behalf, which is let the files come out. Let's do whatever we can to protect the victims, but make sure that the public knows what's there and what's not there. And I'm telling you, you and everyone else is going to be very, very surprised both directions, meaning there's a lot there that people have never known about Jeffrey Epstein, criminal activity that has been conducted and not investigated and not prosecuted. And on the other side, the sensationalism of the type of operation he was running and how many famous people and everything else. It's not what everybody thinks it is. It's going to be much like the Diddy trial was, right? Where it seemed like every actor in Hollywood must have been at a white party in a back room with kids, and it turns out, wait, that's not what happened at all. So there's going to be surprises both ways, but I hope, my hope is the documents are released, the world sees what really happened. They see who actually helped to facilitate the trafficking, and that then there's an investigation and that law enforcement actually takes action, even though it might not be the most famous person in the world that committed the bad acts.
Or even a former U.S. attorney who allowed the bad acts to happen.
Yeah, that's something that needs to come out anyway. Like people need to know if you're willing to do those kind of things on behalf of the government and do it in violation of the victim's rights, then you got to own it. And the world should just know what you did, especially if you're a lawyer that's sworn the oath that we have. If you're willing to do those kind of things, then you shouldn't be so ashamed and try to keep it in a closet forever. That's just my opinion on that one.
Brad, I want to thank you for taking so much time out of your busy schedule to talk to me about this important issue that is taking up a lot of the public oxygen, to also separate fact from fiction. Equally, I want to thank you for driving this and for giving your victims voices where they otherwise would not have been given voices.
Thank you, Joe, for having me and for caring. I really
Yes.
appreciate that.
Looking forward to traveling with you in a few weeks.
Absolutely.
Yes, we're both excited about it. And I want to thank everyone for listening to the official podcast of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks. And I'm Joe Tucker, president of the Academy. Thank you for listening. Take care.